Inuits at the time, they wouldn't live with these because they were too far from the waves and the seas were. So they were about 4 kilometers from the Vikings where they lived. So they lived together. Yes. This is first cat of my grandchild. It's not only one, it's two. And we can say how happy she is. And there is proud mother here. And grandfather. And two coming fishermen, I think, and hunters. Grandchildren. And here is my aunt and my mother. When my mother turned 80, she had forgot, because her memory is not that good anymore, to invite my aunt. So my aunt is telling her, "You forgot to invite me, but I'm here." And this is my father and my stepmother. He's almost 80 now. He's almost as the same age as me. So we will talk a little bit about reforming education in Greenland. And I will say that when we was talking about to start a new school reform in Greenland, what we did was that we invited our cousins from New Zealand, Maoris, and our cousins from here, Alaska, and Oscar Camp, and also Bill Döners. I think it's our cousin, he came, and some other groups from Scandinavia, they also came, and we were having conference with Greenlandic parents, Greenlandic students, and Greenlandic teachers and leaders and politicians. And we got good, I think, good recommendations from all groups. And but the previous reforms in Greenland is that it had been something mostly it was adjustment to the Danish educational system. We already had strong language component in Greenland, but culturally, but also controlling the education from the Greenlanders was lagging very much behind. And even the culture was not included in the legislation of the Greenland education on 1979. That's where the Greenlandic people got home rule government. And after 10 years after the home rule government was introduced, even there, culture was not part of the legislation. And so the most of the instructional language in Greenland was in Greenlandic, because many of the teachers at this time already were Greenlanders, but their education was based on the Western style or Western cultures. And so it was not doing very well for education for Greenland kids. And they were not happy, I think, many of them. So just was these things is saying the same here, that pedagogy in classrooms were something you learn from PSC or something other European psychologists or Scandinavian educators. And it didn't really not fit into the classrooms in Greenland. So the minister, Conrad Steinholt, he was from a very rural part of Greenland, and he was trained as a teacher in Denmark, mixed combination. And one of the Greenlanders who was married to a Danish woman, but had understood to balance the Greenlandic side of his life and the Danish life of his. There was respect, I think, from both sides, from his wife and his wife. So he wanted to make a new school reform. So there was a report made saying, some people make a reform paper or report saying, with children, a nation should be built. I don't, maybe it's not the right translation, but I did. It was a Greenlandic and Danish report. And what his notion was that, can we, in Greenland, can we make the best education in the world? That's what he asked in this report. And so all people in Greenland was starting figure out how can education be better in Greenland? How can it be best in the world? What should be part of the school reform? So it was something he asked, because he was educated as a teacher in Denmark. We should be the smartest teachers in the world, but they were not the smartest in Greenland, I think. So he was asking. And so he wanted also to let the students should succeed academically, but also mentally, social and emotional life. And to meet this, we had to change the legislation in the university, because we had to change the teacher education program and further education of teachers. And we had to also start a new institute of education in the university. And we even also create new university building. And Parliament passed the new legislation, and and this is very much alike what we already had seen in some of the school systems or other parts in the world. but there was something built up, cultural component, historical stuff, and social stuff was part of it. And what also followed was that it's not only one thing you should focus on when you want to change education. You need also to change the preschool activities or preschool education. Many children in Greenland will go to the daycare centers and preschools. Most kids do in Greenland because the father and mother will be working. So these things was, and preschool education was, new legislation was put together, and vocational training also, and also gymnasium is the high school education from grade 11 to grade 14. And higher education was also changed, and also they start training intensively people who are unemployed. And this is part of the Greenland educational plan. And so in this educational plan, it is considered that most of the people in Greenland should be part of the educational system, and they should also have access to good jobs, well-paid jobs through their education. And now we are working with phase number 2 in this Greenland educational program. And I will say that we were funded by also not only from Greenland. Greenlandic municipalities were putting many million kroners, and Greenland government was putting money. But also, even we were not part of the EU, European Union. The European Union gave us about 227 million kroner every year to our program. So it's much money. And we have loans, European since they gave us these 200 millions every year. So that's the, and this educational plan was, as I thought, something created to get a higher level of standard of living for families, so they can provide themselves. And also in this year, there is many families moving from small settlements to the towns, and they need to go into this training and educational activities so they can get better paid jobs. And this phase 2 will also continue focusing on improving educational opportunities for all in our, and also try to use the money we have in the best way. So the preschool reform and the gymnasium, it means high school reform, is something now built into these activities. And the number of high school students, it means who enter education got like this, what do you call it, the number was increasing rapidly over the 5 years. So when you go out in the daytime, you won't see people. They will go into education. Most of them. And so the preschool also, preschool activities have to be now started for all kids, even if they are in small towns, or the school buildings can be something where students can go in there and have some funny activities, maybe with their grandmother or whatever else you have, or grandfather, or some of the uncles you have. And preschool people have been something who are taking care of the kids, and they have not before changed playing with kids, and also have some learning activities or some developmental activities so they can be better users of the language, but also something who can express themselves better, so they can ask for their need. So they don't have to be as polite as Martha was saying. So they can change for themselves, help others, and whatever they can do. So Aviaria will talk about the further education for these activities. A new test will be now produced now by the preschool people when kids are 3 years old and 5 years old. And it is also something, it's part of the healthcare system, because the doctors and the nurses will examine these kids, for example, their ears, their eyes, something. So if there are something you should be attention to in order to secure the development of the child. So the medical system and the social welfare system and educational system can help the child and the family. And now we have a new legislation started in last school year, and that's the first cohort we have, and we are working very well with high school teachers. They seem to like the new reform. So what we also have been doing is also in all over, in preschool and public school, but also in high school, we have been working with improving and strengthening the instructional practice, and also be secure that it can be part of the culture. it's all the things you learn should be contextualized through your culture and through your culture. Of course, to do that, you have to retrain the teachers. So we learned something from these reforms. And that is, the most important is that our kids, I think, are more happy when it's part of themselves, what they are. And part of their history, part of their environment, part of the land we saw. I was telling you about. When we in Greenland, we will say land, ocean, ima, and also rivers and lakes, and the sky. Sky is something you can't. There are not many games in sky, so most of these things we got in Greenland is from the ocean. Yes, but to make a reformulation of the national education system in Greenland, of course, that is something very difficult. But when we did try to do these things, we were a kind of making a backwards design. We were saying, what do we want to reach? What do we want to be in the future? Some of the emphasis was that all Greenlanders should be trilingual. It means Greenlandic as the marathon language, Danish as a first language, and English as their second foreign language. And one of the this backward design was also saying that in 2028, 2/3 of all teachers in public schools should have a master's degree. And there were also something about how many PhDs they also want. But in this backward design, we were a little bit too conservative. We are a little bit behind. In front of this plan. But we don't know in the coming years what will happen. We know that Greenland might be the biggest island. I don't know, maybe it's not. But we have some of the smallest population. And it gives us something to have in our democracy, that we can put something into it, maybe a little bit easier than other nations, big nations. And also because we are a number of populations, we can also maybe better make experimentation and developmental work in education, in the field of education. But of course, we might not be able to generalize much of this, we find out, because our number of students is not very high. And but we believe that we are in the right track right? And maybe we might be something we will recover from these things we have been through over the last 300 years of colonization of Greenland. But what we did exactly, Aviaya, my colleague, will talk about it. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, my name is Aviaya, and I've been working with the Bafta for the last 6-7 years within the school reform that he was talking about. I'd like to tell a little story first to illustrate some of the things that we try to work on. I used this example in the conference in Nunavut a few months ago, and what we experienced is that a lot of people could recognize the feeling of being a native student in a very different school environment, like I know lots of people here have also experienced. The first day when I started at school, I was 5 years old, and it's a big day. And at that day, we all have our national traditional costumes on, and they also have this color, black spots. And I was really happy because there was this color, because I was so shy to stand in front of all these people, so I could hide inside. That was my first day at school. Not really being used to a place where you are measured upon your individualistic competencies, either as a person or academically. And in the school, I learned that if I wanted to become successful and become someone, I needed, first of all, to be good in the Danish language, but also not only language, but also ways of being. Not from my collective values, but from European individualistic values. I had to take away some of my identity in order to become someone. I had to learn to behave like them. I have to learn to stand in front of people like I do today. This has taken me many years. But my daughter is 11. My daughter is a child of this reform. She's got no clue of all these things I have gone through. She speaks Greenlandic and Danish and a little English now, and she's just herself. She's Greenlandic and she speaks Danish whenever she wants, but it doesn't make any interference with her feelings. And not a long time ago, she came home very proud and told me that she made a PowerPoint presentation in the school. 11 years old, standing in front of her whole class, something that took me a whole life to learn, without even losing some of her own cultural ways of being. So that, it might be a really difficult work that we're trying to do in Greenland with the school reform. And we might not be able to measure some of the changes that are happening with the school reform yet. But just to see my daughter like that gives me a lot of hope and believe that something must be good in what we do. This is a picture of, as part of what Bondok was presenting, the school reform. With the school reform were initiated some further education programs. Starting with the academic diploma program, I will go into that, and then you can take a master and a candidate. When you say master here, it's like full degree, right? But it's a bit different from the European system, so we have master and candidate degree. So these are the first ones that we have had since the first or the beginning of their education from the academic diploma until their research degree. So we are very proud of them. In my presentation, I would like to go into 4 things briefly, just to give you an understanding of the context of decolonization in the school system in Greenland. I need to tell you a little bit what kind of colonization had happened since we had to do this kind of decolonization. And then I will try to show a little bit from the Indigenous people's rights, how they are in line with the new school reform. And then tell you a little bit about some of the experience we had in reteaching these teachers and why we had to reteach some of these teachers that we had. Greenland became a Danish colony in 1721. And up to in 1953, this was the official end of colonialism in Greenland, in paper. By becoming a part of Denmark was the form of decolonization that happened. But what we actually did was becoming a part of Denmark, which means we actually became Denmark. We became a town, not a town, how do you call it? Amts? Province?
Forum.
Huh?
Forum.
Borough?
Forum.
Borough.
I don't know what it's called.
Province. Yeah, province or something of Denmark. And that's basically where me as a Greenlander, up through the whole education system, this is where my consciousness stops about colonization. Because we were no longer a colony in 1953, then it's just gone, right? All history books says you're no longer a colony, that's it. And then the modernization process of the country began. No research and no critical insight or teachings curriculum have taught us when we were children that what was actually going on from 1953 was cultural assimilation. Try simply to wipe away our culture by taking in the Danish culture so we could become an equal part. Because the Greenlanders who also wanted to become part of Denmark really believed that if they said yes to that, they would become equal, the word equal, with Denmark. So what was not really questioned is in equality, in whose terms did this happen? But that's another story. So actually, all the way up to home rule government period, there was an intensive cultural assimilation going on through the educational system, so that these Greenlanders could get up to the stage of white people, and in our case, the Danish people. And this happened all through the educational system. And as Bartok already said also, this system was not really decolonized. How can you decolonize something when you're not a colony? Or did I say it right? How can I explain it in Dilk? We just continued the cultural assimilation form up even with the time with the home rule government, because it wasn't really, how can you say it? Because it wasn't really, we were not a colony, so we could just continue. Do you understand? Yeah. Okay. We just had you Bigfoot, you know. We are sleepy. So if you look at the educational system in Greenland, you have to see it with this discourse in the history where it had happened, where all the Inuit children in order to become successful in the educational system, have to adapt the Danish language and the norms, ways of learning, and so forth in order to become successful in education. And by becoming successful in education, it means you will have a better life. And Greenland is really famous for, among indigenous people who have become, we have own government, and even in 2009 we got self-government. So lots of people around the world is looking up to that. But we haven't, in that period, there wasn't really a form of decolonization in terms of the human decolonization or decolonization of education. I mean, the whole emotional and cultural part of who we are were never really touched before. So it means we had a lot of great political, we've been taking over new areas from Denmark, becoming more and more self-governing and so on, and we're struggling with our economy, but not really talk about that we need any kind of decolonization. So that's why I say that still, but less. But a lot of the time have been influenced by colonial amnesia, simply like not being aware of how history has shaped us. And even today, when people begin to, I mean, when we work with these things, we go through a lot of things in society and from people. And some people love to say that we want to go back to history, or we want to go backwards, or whatever. But simply a general lack of understanding of how this has affected us. And I think I was here, when I was here speaking about mental decolonization, I mentioned it once, that colonial influence on identity and our emotions is not something historical. It's right there. When my mom was sent to boarding school in Denmark, and my mom still struggling with her emotions in her life, but also even on me, just to give a hug or whatever, nobody should ever tell me that this is something that happened. This is something that is right here and it's fully alive. Another thing that we see now, because of this way of the way the education system has been brought, is that now, today, there's a very strong polarization between those who are now educated and non-educated. So we have a Greenlandic population becoming like the more elite, you know, the high, well-doing Greenlanders, earning great money, doing great stuff, and then you have a population who have a very, very low income and live in rural places and simply do not have the same chances for further education because they still are not good in speaking Danish, or are maybe not, or are maybe more traditional in their ways of living because maybe they don't want to leave their family to move to the city and so forth. You know, all these things. So we have a very strong polarization between those being educated and non-educated. So this is still a case, very much still a case. So what's interesting in terms of education and some of these conventions for indigenous people is just to take an example, is that our colonialism stopped in 1953, and our cultural assimilation happened up through, within education. It happened until the new school, or the Doctor was talking about in 2002. Although at the international level, they began to work away from assimilationist orientation. since 1957. So this is also very interesting in terms of the international conventions and orientations, because once you are no longer a colony, does it mean then that you can do whatever, or what is it? So these are only some questions that we ourselves in Greenland are beginning to question, begin to understand, begin to see, and try to find our way by beginning to question these things that we have not been conscious about. But in terms of school law, the biggest change from these European assimilation educational models into the new school law that we have now is that the former laws that Bartok was talking about have a pure focus on skills. A human person is a body that needs knowledge only here. And then you will become successful. That's the way education has been brought in many, many ways in Greenland. The new law says that now we have to educate children from a whole person perspective or approach. Their feelings need to be there. We have to teach and respect their ways of learning, their language, and so forth. So that's the biggest difference that we have to do. Then going back to some of these conventions, this declaration of Indigenous people from 2007 is quite interesting because then some of these things, like any form of forced assimilation should not be expected, should not be there for Indigenous peoples, and Indigenous people have the right to establish and control the education systems. And that's pretty interesting because actually, with our school reform in 2002, we already started to do these things. So, but the Indigenous people's rights came up in 2007. So in that way, it could also be said that we have had the freedom compared to many indigenous peoples to create our own educational system based on our culture and our language. So although we might have gone through a lot of assimilation, we now have a huge opportunity to create our own educational system. So the reform has been implemented through many different initiatives, but one of them, and particularly the one me and Bartok's been working with, is reteaching teachers as part of a decolonization process. So by creating these new academic programs, we have teachers who are already teachers, experienced teachers, coming into our programs and get education and further training in order to be able to implement the new school regulation. And imagine a whole system that consists of mostly Greenlanders and Greenlandic-speaking teachers who have never learned to teach using culture, never learned how to respect a child's identity, because they were never taught like that. It's not enough to be indigenous or enough just to say I'm indigenous, then I can teach. If you have been a product of the old time and you have not learned these skills, then what do you do? So a lot of this retraining have had to deal with the new things in the regulation because a lot of the teachers simply did not have the background to teach the new law. Even though they're all almost all Greenlandic speaking. And I know that, for example, in Alaska, when the language issue is very big and some groups of people have lost their language and it's a sensitive issue, then I can say that although we speak our language, it's not enough for us. If we haven't unlearned the colonization of mind, you know what I mean? So they have to go together in our case because of the way we were colonized. And just to illustrate what kind of students are we talking about in the school, around 50% of the children stops after public school and do not engage in any further education from there. So we do have a lot of kids who still need to go to further to the education system. And most of these children who don't enter the further educational system mainly speak Greenlandic and are mainly traditional in their homes. So it means year 2013, it's very provocative, but it is still those children that adapt the Danish language, values and norms in the further educational system who can become someone, even in a time with self-government. So that's why we have a very big job to do with our school reform. Like we said, that the pedagogy, how do we actually questions before this reform that were never questioned is, for example, how do they learn? How do the system adapt to them so they learn and become strong? All the time it has been the opposite way. How do they adapt to the system to become someone? So what we really, one of our biggest goals or aims for this school reform is to be able, through research and further education, to be able to learn to teach these children a lot better. And when we say we want more culture in the school, we don't necessarily say that they should just be Greenlandic speaking and they should all have students and that's it. What we are talking about is the social-cultural approach. How do these kids learn? So our focus is very much on the form of pedagogy that is needed for those children. So just to give an example of some of the contents of the kind of educational programs we have initiated is, for example, the knowledge of societal and cultural development in Greenland. We have been looking at the new forms of pedagogy. We've been working with researchers from around the world, and big postdocs been researching and working with people like Ray, Will, and Dermot, lot of really good people who's been working with Indigenous research and learning for many years. So we have tried to collect a lot of knowledge about these things that our teachers have not had the chance to learn from before. Some of the modules that our students take are very much like other places in the world, but there are 3 modules that we have made specifically for this context and for the Greenlandic context. It's ethics and pedagogy is that's a long story. Barto can tell much more about it. Effektiv pædagogik har jeg faktisk svart på. Yeah, basically trying to make pedagogy using culture. It's not made in Greenland. We've been working with Professor Roland Dahl, who's been working with Navajo Indians and the Hawaii people. And then it's been developed further for a Greenlandic context. And then we have development and learning, and this should be educational anthropology. It's a bad English translation. Which are some of the issues that are totally new in our context and in terms of this educational research. Can I take it? Yeah, it's almost over. So if we take this course, for example, that me and Barto have developed and worked on and taught a lot of students with, we have talked about the colonial amnesia, not being aware of how culture and how colonial conditions have shaped who you are. This course gives the students opportunity to explore a more holistic view of why the society is as it is now. Why do we have some students who have suddenly realized that they have taken the very authoritative role of old teachers, do this, and do this, without even ever thought about if it's really suitable for their own way of being or their own culture. And a lot of them have been dealing a lot with low self-confidence because they never fitted into the system. So we have a student saying, like, why didn't we learn this 40 years ago instead of using all my life to question myself if I was good enough and so forth. So it's been a new way of thinking and a new approach into education and teaching children. And what we have experienced with the teachers, and this was really never intended. This is really interesting perspective. We think it's. Of course, we wanted to reteach the teachers because they should be able to teach from the new school law and so forth, and learning new forms of pedagogy that are culturally comprehensive. But then, of course, we realized that we had to do the same on the teachers. So we have had to develop also our way of teaching teachers in order for them to get something out of these classes. So we have also been forced to teach not through only their skills, but also through their emotions, their identity, and so forth. Most of these teachers that we are reteaching are from the peak of cultural assimilation time. So they have a very strong mismatch in terms of how education should be and how they are themselves as people. So a couple of minutes. Just very briefly, we're almost out of time. So some of the things that have been challenging in introducing these types of new programs or new initiatives in order to implement this new school reform. As just to give short examples. First of all, how the white population in Greenland, both Danish, Greenlandic people, how they have reacted to this kind of new way of thinking. So we have had to deal with a lot of misunderstanding about what is culture. We have had reactions like we want to go back in time, or reactions that we are having a racist project against Danish people, and so forth. And another challenge we have faced is that the teachers themselves need to rethink the way they look at culture, because they have also taken a very colonialistic view of what is culture. So it's very interesting. So what we see is that if we want to implement such a school reform that changes the whole society and the whole educational system, we somehow need to accompany it has to be accompanied by a human or mental decolonizational process. What we have seen in our students is that this has not just been teaching. There is all the traumas, all the traumas and all the feelings of not being good enough have been stirred up during these programs. It was never the intention, and believe us, we are either therapists or anything, we're just to try to do our jobs. It's been emotionally very, very, very hard journey, which was not intended with our students. Because they are part of history, they are part of it all. We can't just teach people as objects, like in old days. So we have to teach ourselves too. And of course, maybe we can also admit that we have also had to go through very strong emotional processes, which was never intended either. So it's been a long journey, and it's still a journey. But we see with our students that by beginning to allowing them to feel who they are and beginning to try to teach them in ways where they think they learn better, we have seen a lot of professional development in our teachers, and a lot of them have come with the evaluation that had they not gone through these processes, they would not be able to implement the new school reform. Just as a short ending, like I already also mentioned, is that culture is really something that is so misunderstood and can be viewed through so many kind of optics. And I think the main opposition comment in Greenland, can you say that in English? One of the main comments for people being opposed to this reform has been that including agriculture will bring us back in time. So this has been some of the strongest challenges we have had in order to try to implement a reform like that. But it is our belief that if we not begin to do that, we will go back in time. So that's what we believe with this reform. I hope you can understand my English. Sleepy English.